Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. I've been thinking a lot about the Pierce Brosnan era recently. In my mission to make this the year of the book Bond, I've been diving both into the Ian Fleming novels and the continuation novels. I've been rereading the novels of Raymond Benson. This here is Never Dream of Dying. It's the one I'm currently working through. And if you haven't read the Raymond Benson Bond novels, you really should, at least if you are a fan of the Pierce Brosnan era, because I think even if you are a fan of Pierce Brosnan's Bond, like I am, you'll admit that his era felt inconsistent. It wasn't the era that Pierce Brosnan deserved. There's a sense in which the Pierce Brosnan era feels like it lacks some of the ambition that powered the early eras. In fact, I remember growing up with the Pierce Brosnan era, and one of the reasons I was excited in the lead up to Die Another Day is that Die Another Day seemed to be returning to the spirit of grandeur that the series had had back in its heyday, when we're looking back at the epics that Bond had in the 1960s and the 1970s. Die Another Day was very much an attempt to return Bond to that sort of grand, adventurous canvas. And that's not to say that every Bond film needs to be an epic, but there's a sense in which the Pierce Brosnan movies are constrained in their imagination. And what I think is so wonderful about what Raymond Benson was able to do during his tenure as a Bond author is that he bridges the gap between the literary Bond and the cinematic Bond very well, and he's taking his cues from the Brosnan era. That was part of what he was asked to do when he took on the writing position as Bond continuation author. And Raymond Benson's great talent is imagination. He has a great zest for set pieces. So in his novels, you have things like Bond surviving in the Australian outback, struggling to find sources of water to keep himself alive. You have Bond facing off against a bull in a bull ring because the villain is a matador. You have Bond attending a film festival. There's so much color in what Raymond Benson brings to his Bond series that it reflects on what the Pierce Brosnan era might have been with a little bit more ambition. And that's not to say that that ambition wasn't there. In fact, if you read the early draft of Tomorrow Never Dies, it's out there on the internet. You can read the original starting point for what Tomorrow Never Dies would become. It had a lot more color. It had Bond meeting Paris Carver during the Venetian Carnival wearing a mask and being chased through the streets of Venice. You have the parking garage car chase equivalent being set in the Kuala Lumpur towers. You have this sort of grand canvas. But by the time the Pierce Brosnan movies eventually got to filming, there's a sense in which they pull back a little bit from that grandiosity, that color. And that's disappointing because so much of what the Bond series thrives on isn't story, but texture. This is a series where villains are people who are so obsessed with gold that they will dispatch someone by coating them head to toe in gold paint so that their skin suffocates. These are the kinds of things that make Bond Bond. And in the Pierce Brosnan era, you see flirtations with that. You see them making brief attempts to get at that sort of exoticism. In Tomorrow Never Dies, it's a great example that they have that fine little monologue about chakra torture, but there's just not much that comes of it. And what I love about the Raymond Benson novels is that those concepts are there and he really digs into them. One of the most beloved Raymond Benson novels is High Time to Kill, which essentially takes the story of the Eiger Sanction, if you've read that spy novel, and transposes it into the world of James Bond, with Bond and a bunch of other competitors trying to scale a mountain to get a valuable resource that the world's intelligence community is craving that has landed there due to a plane crash. It's actually a terrific premise, and you can imagine that just unfolding as an exciting adventure on screen. In fact, Raymond Benson's novels mostly read as film novelizations. I think that's actually Raymond Benson's great strength as a Bond author, is that his Bond novels feel like film novelizations for films that were never filmed. So you can read it and you really just get a sense for the Brosnan era we deserved, starting with 0-10, which is in some ways the version of the original Tomorrow Never Dies story that they didn't go with, which is about the Hong Kong handoff. Raymond Benson really leans into that story and adds in a lot of color. That's where the Australian outback set piece occurs. There's a wonderful mahjong game. What a thrilling adventure that would have been for Brosnan's Bond. There's the Facts of Death, which is set in the kind of Grecian part of the world with this sort of mystery around this killer. Bond in general in the movies has never really confronted this sort of serial killer archetype. That's happened in the continuation novels a few different times, and the way Raymond Benson builds up that story would have been a really novel texture for Pierce Brosnan's Bond that still brings a lot of the cinematic glamour and color. And then you get Benson's big contribution, of which this is the climax, the Union trilogy. Raymond Benson was tasked with creating a successor for Spectre for a new era, and he creates this criminal syndicate called the Union, led by this mysterious blind figure, Le Geron. And it's an idea that feels like it can really anchor three adventures in a row. Those adventures are somewhat loosely connected, but if Pierce Brosnan had been able to do a full arc like that, you could have feel the way that his era would have really started to come together, started to develop a real sense of momentum. Raymond Benson's final novel sends Bond back to Japan, something that I've been dying for the movies to do. And what's wonderful about each of these novels is they keep that sort of cinematic scope. Raymond Benson's talent is coming up with these grand, big concepts, big set pieces. I just finished reading Double Shot not long ago. Double Shot was my favorite of the Benson novels when I read them many years ago. It's not my favorite now, but there's a wonderful idea in it, which is that this villainous organization, the Union, is trying to get revenge on Bond by essentially making him think he might be mad. And so Bond's psyche is being worn down over the course of the book. Now, I don't think Double Shot lives up to that concept, but if you think through these novels almost as like first pass versions of movie stories, you can see how that could have been developed into such an exciting, interesting Bond adventure, with Bond going off to hunt this villain organization that is trying to frame him while he's struggling with periods of lost time and blackouts and hallucinations. What a fun Bond movie that would have been for Pierce Brosnan to lean into. This is really the case for reading the Bond continuation novels, whether it's Raymond Benson, whether it's John Gardner, whether it's Anthony Horowitz. These novels, at their best, have such strong concepts. My favorite of the Gardner novels is Nobody Lives Forever, in which the villain puts out a price on Bond's head, and Bond is outrunning this cabal of somewhat goofy, colorful assassins. It's almost like Bond at the center of a John Wick manhunt. It's such an exciting concept, and it's a shame that the movies have never really leaned into that. And in reading these novels, we can start to fill in the gaps in the movie eras and envision entire films that never existed. And I think Raymond Benson does that especially well. I think when I read his era of novels, I see the Pierce Brosnan era that I wish existed. So if you haven't read the Raymond Benson novels, I think it's time to do so, especially if you're a Pierce Brosnan fan. They read just like Pierce Brosnan Bond movies in tone, in approach, but they're bigger, they're grander, they have more colorful conceits, and they have a more satisfying arc over the course of the books. And in general, I think the continuation novels are a really satisfying place for Bond fans to kind of dig in this no man's land between movies. Let me know if you've read the Raymond Benson novels. Let me know what you think about those, because I'm really interested in how the Bond community perceives this chapter of the Bond legacy, the Raymond Benson legacy, and whether they feel that it's connected to the Pierce Brosnan film legacy in the way that I do. I mostly enjoyed these at the same time, so my experience growing up with the Pierce Brosnan Bond was also very much growing up with the Raymond Benson Bond, and the two feel like two sides of the same coin for me. After all, Raymond Benson was the author writing the official novelizations of the Pierce Brosnan films outside of Goldeneye. And that sensibility just feels like it seamlessly carries over. These feel like the lost Pierce Brosnan movies. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.